Well, this new Constitution we've been talking about, whose preamble begins with the words, "We the people." Who are those people? And exactly what does all that mean? Well, for one thing, let's talk about the people. There are three groups mentioned in the Constitution. There is the people, which is referring to citizens of the United States. And there are Indians mentioned in the Constitution. And there are, quote, other persons, which means slaves. So three main groups: citizens, Native American Indians, and slaves. Now, Indians were not citizens until 1924, so they weren't included in We the People. Who was included in We the People? Well, everybody else, right? Everyone that was a citizen, which made this new form of government, this new country, unique and different from other countries in existence at the time, in that it was framed around civic nationalism rather than ethnic nationalism, at least theoretically. Theoretically, to be a citizen of the country, you had to be born there. Eventually, 14th Amendment is going to clarify that, or immigrate there. And a lot of people had immigrated. Remember when we looked at the ethnic backgrounds of all the different people that wound up in the English colonies, all different parts of Europe, at least, plus, of course, those Africans who had been transported across the Atlantic. But in line with the vision of Thomas Paine, this was going to be a country framed around an idea and framed around republicanism. The idea that working together and working toward classical liberal ideals of individual liberty and freedom, and then promoting the common good, that's what was going to bind the people together, not whether or not they had all originally come from the same country or same group of people. Now, I said theoretically because we know that's not exactly how it was working. Even in the beginning, there were a lot of people excluded. But over time, at least some of those people gradually began to be included, making it more, making it adhere more to that civic nationalism model. Well, just to kind of emphasize that, let's take a look at the very first immigration law in 1790. Remember, the government just started in March of 1789. So the Naturalization Act made clear that immigration to the United States was open to all, quote, free white people of good moral character. So that's very specific in not only whom it includes, but who it excludes. Theoretically, again, people from Africa or Asia would not have been welcome to become naturalized citizens under this first immigration law. A lot of them moved here anyway. Also, even among free white people, there was this good moral character phrase. That's because, after all, we're not Australia, right? Which was started as a penal colony and a place to send for England, for Britain rather, to send their criminals. So, anyway, from the very beginning, this we the people and this all men are created equal, which excludes women right there, but even the all men being created equal, we know that wasn't exactly so, right? So Native Americans aren't equal, slaves aren't equal. As we will see, former slaves or the descendants of former slaves will not be equal. People from non-European backgrounds aren't necessarily welcomed at this point, and we'll see more of that. But this was the beginning. This was the beginning, and we're going to trace and see how it develops over time. But first, well, when it comes to the three groups, we'll be talking a lot more about the people that are included here. And we've already talked about slaves and free blacks in the New Republic, in the young country. I do want to, though, mention a couple of individuals now that kind of entered the scene around this time period, a couple of African Americans. One was Benjamin Banneker, who was a scientist. Now, Thomas Jefferson, and I've mentioned this before, most of the founding fathers believed that slavery was an evil, or at least they said it was, and they believed it was going to die out. They believed it was going to end. However, Thomas Jefferson, who subscribed to that theory and who had slaves, had a, as he phrased it, a suspicion that blacks were naturally inferior to white people. He didn't believe that about American Indians. He believed that they had the potential to be equal. But he believed that people of African descent did not, so he thought one day slavery should end and all the black people should be free somewhere else. And his viewpoint that black people were inferior was based on his assertion that they were incapable of rational thought. They were just guided by their passions. And that's where Benjamin Banneker comes in. He wrote an astronomical almanac. He also later was one of the people who surveyed and designed the capital of Washington, D.C. Thomas Jefferson, in one of his letters in reference to Benjamin Banneker, said, and I'm paraphrasing, "I wonder what white guy wrote that for him," essentially. Now, many Northerners were starting to become opposed to slavery, and some very prominent ones of the Founding Father generation would start to call for the end of slavery, including Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Now, the other person we want to look at is Phyllis Wheatley, who had been born in Africa, taken captive at a young age, transported to North America as a slave, and she became a slave in Boston, Massachusetts. So remember, there were small numbers of slaves, most of them household servants, in northern cities. She achieved fame as a poet. The family that owned her taught her to write, and she really took to it. And that family even sponsored her getting her poetry published in book form, as well as in, periodicals and stuff, beginning in 1773. Her poetry and she herself was greatly admired by the French philosopher Voltaire, and also by someone who I think met her, George Washington. I'm not sure if he met her, but he was certainly impressed by her poetry. Now, while she's writing this poetry, she was still a slave, and her owners took her on a tour, like a speaking tour of the North. And it was very uncomfortable because people were saying, like, wow, this woman is absolutely brilliant. How can you own her? And eventually they freed her, and she left that family and got married to a young free black man, and lived in poverty. I think died of disease at a pretty young age. So that's a sad part to the story. But it's important to note that in the 1700s, she was famous for her literary output, for her poetic ability. But what about that third group, the American Indians, who were mentioned specifically in the Constitution? What's their situation going to be? I talked briefly about their kind of status at the end of the war, but now I'm going to go more in depth and talk about several different things from the Revolution all the way through to about 1800 in Indian country. And we're going to start in the American Revolution, which was the beginning of what are called the Chickamauga Wars that would last for 18 years. And the Chickamauga was a confederacy of Native Americans, primarily Cherokees. The principal Cherokee we're going to be talking about here is this guy, Dragging Canoe, who was the son of the famous Cherokee leader Atakulakula, whose name is translated by the English into Little Carpenter, which isn't a very accurate translation. It actually means like a piece of wood leaning against something. Atakulakula, or Little Carpenter, was a peace chief, and he had been responsible for negotiating the peace in the Anglo-Cherokee War. Now, remember when we were talking about native culture and matrilineal societies in particular, and the Cherokees are matrilineal, I said, your father isn't that influential if you're a male, not even technically related to you. So a lot of history books will point out Dragging Canoe, why he was the son of Atakulakula. But that's not really the important thing to know about him. The important thing to know about him is he was the nephew of Oconostota, who was the great Cherokee war leader. Oconostota's sister married Atakulakula. So it was Oconostota who was really the mentor to Dragging Canoe. Dragging Canoe, at the time the American Revolution broke out, was in his late 30s, and he was the chief of one of the smaller Cherokee towns. It was called Long Island, or sometimes in English, Big Island or Great Island town. It's not Long Island in New York. It's a big island on the Tennessee River that had a Cherokee town on it. Okay, so he was a leader in his own right. When the revolution started in 1776, a group, a diplomatic attaché group, essentially, from the north came to the Cherokee towns with delegates from the Shawnee, who had been the, lifelong enemies and then later allies of the Cherokees. The Mohawks, again, they're part of the Iroquois Confederacy, lifelong enemies of the Cherokees. And the Ottawas. Remember, that was the tribe of Pontiac. So they came down to the Cherokee town of Chota, which was the most prominent Cherokee town, and they brought with them a wampum belt. Remember, if you do remember, back when we talked about the alliances, between the Iroquois and the Dutch, we talked about wampum. It's like beaded shells that are sort of like strung together. As kind of a belt, and that's what was used often for treaties. They brought a red belt, just totally red, and that means war. And they were inviting the Cherokees to join them in war alongside the British against the Americans. Now, the most of the Cherokee leaders, the older leaders, including Atakulakula, who was a man of peace, refrained. They were not in favor of this because the Anglo-Cherokee War had been very destructive to them. So they wanted to sit this one out. But Dragging Canoe wanted none of that. He inspired many of the younger warriors, was ready to join in the fight. Now, he's in his late 30s. When he was about 20 years old, as a young warrior, he had fought in the Anglo-Cherokee War against the English. So now, of course, he's going to be fighting on the side of the English. Now let's talk a moment about Dragging Canoe and his name, by the way. Here's how he got his name. When he was about 8 or 9 years old, his uncle was leading a war party. And so they were going to get in their canoes and they were going to paddle down to whoever it was they were going to attack at that particular time. And this little kid wanted to go along, and his uncle told him, his uncle was leading the raid, "You are too young to come along. You're too small. See how all the warriors are each carrying their own canoe over their head to put in the water? When you are big enough that you can carry your own canoe, then you can come. And so they went down to the water, carried their canoes, and then they looked back behind them, and here's this little kid dragging this big canoe, trying to get to them to join them. And so, of course, he wasn't allowed to go because he was too small, but this is what earned him his name. He drags his canoe, or dragging canoe, to the English colonists. And that indicated that even as a small boy, he wanted to get in on the fight. He had a lot of courage. Well, he began to lead raids against the colonists, the Americans, in East Tennessee, which was part of North Carolina, and surrounding areas. The militia responded by attacking the Cherokee towns. And exactly what Atakulakula had been afraid of is exactly what happened. That is to say, the same thing that happened in 1761 at the end of the Anglo-Cherokee War. The American militias came through and burned all their crops and burned down their towns. They even burned their most sacred town to the ground. And so they were stuck. They didn't have food for the winter. And so the Cherokee leaders immediately surrendered. So this is in 1776. This is just a few months into the war. Dragging Canoe refused to surrender. Now, part of the surrender meant they were giving up part of their lands again. He refused to give up any more lands. However, he did not have the support of most of the Cherokee leaders. So he took his warriors, who came from all the different towns, who followed him, and they left the Cherokee towns, and they went down, traveled southeast to the area around what is now Chattanooga, and from there farther west into northern Alabama, and they set up their own new towns, separate from the Cherokees who had surrendered, because they were not intending to surrender. They were going to continue the fight. And the biggest of these towns was called Chickamauga. And so this group of Cherokees became known to the American colonists as the Chickamaugas, or sometimes the Chickamauga Cherokees. So the Chickamaugas started fighting, picked right up. They just continued. They didn't start. They continued fighting from 1776 for the next 18 years until 1794. And the force led by Dragging Canoe included these rebel Cherokees who refused to surrender for the most part, but also some Creek Indians, some Indians from other tribes, and some Shawnee Indians. In fact, there's going to be a period of close cooperation continuing between the Chickamauga Cherokees and the Shawnees, who also, after the American Revolution was over, kept fighting up in the Ohio country. And in fact, Dragging Canoe set up what I think could be called a warrior exchange program, in which he sent his own brother up north to Ohio with a band of Cherokee warriors, Chickamauga warriors, to basically join up with the Shawnee up there. And the Shawnees sent down a band of Shawnees to join the Chickamauga Cherokees. And this happened in the early 1790s. So we've extended our way beyond the end of the American Revolution. Now, let's talk about basically what was going to be a two-front war that the United States is going to be fighting against the Chickamauga Cherokees in the south and the Shawnees up in the Ohio territory, and points in between, because you've got some Cherokees up there, some Shawnees down there, and we're going to see how that turned out. The western frontier was this area. So in that area, the Continental Army, the Army of the United States, was having to fight against the British, but they were also fighting against Native Americans. In the northern part of that frontier, they were fighting against the Shawnee and their allies. And, as we discussed, in the southern part, they started off fighting against the Cherokees, but that only lasted for a few months before the leadership of the Cherokees surrendered. But then several of the Cherokee warriors broke away, formed a new group called the Chickamauga Cherokees. And the Chickamaugas, along with allies from the Creek Nation and the Chickamaugas and some Shawnees who had come south, sort of an exchange program, were fighting against the U.S. forces in the South. That lasted through the end of the war and beyond. So here are some of those new towns that the Chickamauga Cherokees formed southeast of the main Cherokee towns. And as you can see, not only in southeastern Tennessee, but also in northern Georgia and even a couple of places in northern Alabama. The Chickamaugas were led during this time by Dragging Canoe, who led them, for 16 years in this fight until he passed away in his 50s in 1792, probably of a heart attack. He collapsed after dancing all night at a victory party, and he was replaced then by young Tassel, alias John Watts, for the remainder of the war. Now, I go into great detail in discussion of the Chickamauga Wars and the principal leaders and warriors of the Chickamaugas beyond just Dragging Canoe in my Cherokee history class. So we're not going to take the time to do all of that here, so suffice it to say, this was a long fight, very long fight. At one point in 1791, over the course of that year, 107 travelers were killed on the road between Knoxville and Nashville. So that's not all at once. That was just over the course of the year. Several people per month. And again, that's not military attacks. That's just counting the people just on that one road in that 1 year. Now, as I've mentioned a couple of times, there were Shawnee warriors who came down from Ohio in exchange for some Cherokees that went up to Ohio. And the Shawnee band, the contingent that came down from Ohio, was led by a warrior named Cherokees, who was, the older brother of Tecumseh, and he brought Tecumseh along. Tecumseh was a young warrior at this time. Cherokees was killed in an assault on the Cumberland settlements near Fort Nashboro, and then Tecumseh took over leadership of that band. So for a couple of years in the early 1790s, Tecumseh was active in the upper Cumberland area of Tennessee, leading raids in conjunction with the Cherokee Chickamauga leaders. The last battle of the Chickamauga Wars took place at Rock Island in what is now White County, and on the map that's there on the left, right there in the upper Cumberland, just south of Cookeville, where Tennessee Tech is. That battle, the Cherokees were led by Doublehead, one of the very important Cherokee leaders that unfortunately I don't have time to discuss at great length in this class. So that was the last big skirmish, big battle. About a year later, in Crab Orchard in what is now Cumberland County, Thomas Sharp Spencer, alias Bigfoot Spencer, the legendary frontiersman, was killed in an ambush by Cherokees there, by Chickamauga Cherokees. He had been hired to protect a group of surveyors who were out there, deciding how they were going to divide up the Cherokee land when they got it. So, anyway, that was the end of the long and legendary career of Bigfoot Spencer. So, 1794, Chickamauga Wars came to an end, and the reason they ended when they did and how they did had a lot to do with what was going on farther to the north in Ohio with the Chickamauga Cherokees' allies, the Shawnee. Now, they had, if you will recall, the Shawnees were part of the group that came down and invited the Cherokees to go to war against the new United States in 1776. But at that time, not all the Shawnees were in favor of going to war. There was one individual in particular, a very prominent, a very influential Shawnee leader named Cornstalk. He was in his late 50s at this time. As a younger man, he had fought against the English in the French and Indian War, and he may have participated in Lord Dunmore's war, but by this point he had come to the conclusion that really the Shawnee could not win against the power of the new United States, and so he was trying to get his Shawnee brethren not to commit to going to war at the beginning of the Revolution. Unfortunately, he came in under a flag of truce with several of his relatives and supporters in 1777, and was immediately captured and murdered by the militia to whom he had come in to discuss peace. So that sort of tilted the balance as to where the Shawnees were going to go. And if that sounds very similar to what happened with the Mingo leader Logan, who was actually on the side of the English, well, yes, it is. It's also similar to something that would happen 11 years after this in 1788, when one of the more prominent Chickamauga Cherokees, a guy named Tassel, or Corn Tassel, a little bit of an irony there, Cornstalk, Corn Tassel, also tried to do the same thing to try to end the hostilities with the Cherokee, and was murdered, and then that ended any chance at negotiation at that point. Well, fast forward late 1780s, early 1790s. The Revolution's been over for a decade. Both the Shawnee and the Chickamauga had slowed down in their fighting. But of course, with the Chickamaugas, the murder of Tassel is going to really stir them up again. This is when Dragging Canoe instituted that warrior exchange program. So all the while that the Chickamaugas into the 1790s are fighting against the United States in the South, then a very large confederacy led by the Shawnees renew efforts to basically chase out the Americans in the Ohio country. It was called the Western Confederacy. It included several different tribes from the Ohio area, including the Miami tribe. They're not from Florida. They're the Miami of Ohio, which is why that university is called Miami of Ohio. One of the principal leaders of the Miami was Little Turtle, and of course the Shawnee, who had as one of their principal leaders Blue Jacket. And by the way, if you follow hockey, you may be familiar with the team, the Columbus Blue Jackets. Columbus is in Ohio, so that's where they get that name. And also the Delaware, that had started off, in Delaware and Pennsylvania and had been pushed out to Ohio by this time. And then those Cherokee that had come north, sent by Dragging Canoe. This extension, this renewal of war, really took off, like I said, in the early 1790s. And initially, the Western Confederacy did pretty well in their battles against the United States Army and the militia there out on the frontier. Now, part of the reason for that is the American Revolution had been over for a decade. Many of the American soldiers had not been at war during that time. Some of them had never been at war. The Western Confederacy tribes had been continually at war, so that gave them an advantage. The U.S. forces were very badly organized. Once they weren't fighting the British anymore, most of the American militias and army went home. And so there wasn't a very large standing army at all. And then, the militias that were raised on the frontier were made up of people that weren't that experienced militarily. Well, I said they had some successes early on. Their biggest success was the Battle of the Wabash, which is a river in Ohio, also known as St. Clair's Defeat. In this one, there was a force of Western Confederacy warriors, about 1,000 strong, so Shawnee and Miami and Delaware, and a small number of Cherokees, about 1,000 of them, and they took on about 1,000 U.S. soldiers. A regiment usually is 800 men, sometimes up to 1,000 men. So they were evenly matched, about the same number on each side. Okay? In the battle, the Indians won. The Indians won, losing about 40 to 50 warriors killed. The soldiers had 630 soldiers killed. 630 killed, and then about 300 more wounded. All right, 320 roughly wounded. Now, casualty rates, you've heard about casualties. Casualties doesn't mean the number of people killed. It means the total number of people killed, plus people wounded, plus people missing. So out of roughly 1,000 soldiers, 950 of them were casualties. The Indians call this the Battle of the 1,000 Slain. They didn't quite slay 1,000, but they came pretty close, and they incapacitated, certainly, 95% of 1,000 people. Now this battle, this victory, was the largest loss that the United States had ever suffered against Indians, and it would in fact be the largest loss the United States Army would ever face against Indians. Now, perhaps you're familiar with the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which was the U.S. cavalry led by General George Custer, actually Lieutenant Colonel at that time, George Custer, against the Sioux Nation and their allies, again, in 1876. And you know that Custer's command was wiped out. He had a regiment of about 800 men, but the whole regiment wasn't wiped out. It was Custer's command. He had divided his group into 3 parts, and he took his part and went right down the middle, and then one part going around each side. His part that went down the middle, they were all killed. There's about 200 to 250 guys there. So that's how many of them were killed. Here you've got 630. Much, much larger loss even than the Little Bighorn. Also, a 95% casualty rate. This still holds the record for the largest casualty rate suffered by a regiment in a battle in American history. So, really, really a big deal, a huge victory. A huge victory that definitely got the attention of President George Washington in a big way, and convinced him that the army needed to be improved, and he knew just the guy to do it. In charge of that, he placed one of his favorite generals from the American Revolution, Anthony Wayne, known by the nickname of Mad Anthony Wayne. Mad as in, like crazy, because he was so extraordinarily bold in battle that he would just like run in where other people were afraid to go. So he put him in charge, and General Wayne assembled what became known as the Legion of the United States. Now, you know that there were Roman legions in the Roman Empire. What is a legion? It doesn't just mean a whole bunch of people. A legion is actually a military group that includes infantry and cavalry and artillery all in one unit. So he trains them heavily, and gets them into shape, and then takes them up to fight the Western Confederacy. And in August of 1794, there is a huge battle, a very conclusive battle, called the Battle of Fallen Timbers, near present-day Toledo, Ohio. And it was kind of a reverse of that earlier Battle of the Wabash. The American soldiers this time, they won decisively, and the Western Confederacy was forced to surrender. This was August 1794. Right after that, the Chickamauga Cherokees down south surrendered as well. The treaty at Tellico Blockhouse in East Tennessee, and that's because they now knew that before, the U.S. Army was divided, having to fight Shawnees in the north, Cherokees in the south, but with the Shawnees surrendered, the whole force of the Army could be brought down upon the Chickamauga Cherokees, and there's no way they could win. So both regions essentially surrendered. 1794 is an extremely, extremely important date in American Indian history. For those tribes in the South, for most of them, 1794 marked the end of their fighting against the U.S. Army and U.S. government. Now, the Creek Indians, some of them would fight against the U.S. government. Again, Cherokees never would, nor would the Choctaws, nor would the Creeks after this big defeat. Now, up north, the Shawnees, that was a different story. Anyway, kind of a side point, but Mad Anthony Wayne his name was used by a writer in the an artist in the 1930s named Bob Kane. Bob Kane, who got together with a writer friend named Bill Finger and came up with a comic book character called the Batman. And they wanted to have a really cool secret identity name for him, so they combined Scottish rebel King Robert the Bruce with this American general, Mad Anthony Wayne, and came up with Bruce Wayne. So, again, that doesn't really have anything to do with American history, but it's very fascinating, and I always like to point that out. Anyway, the Shawnee Confederacy, the Western Confederacy, Shawnees, Miamis, and etc., they were forced to sign a treaty at Fort Greenville a few months after this defeat, and they were forced to give up most of Ohio. Now, remember, earlier they had been forced to sign a treaty after Lord Dunmore's War when they had to give up Kentucky. Now they've had to give up most of Ohio. They're just left with about a third of Ohio, as you can see up there at this point. And so that was, that was a heavy blow against them. But remember, the young warrior named Tecumseh, he had gone down and served under Dragging Canoe, where he got to see the strategies and tactics dragging canoe successfully used for years. And he got to see how dragging canoe had actually not only unified all those rebellious Cherokees, but he had won over the Creek Indians, many of them, and many from other tribes as well. And so he was sort of a student of dragging canoe. And later on, he's still a young man here. He went back up to Ohio, and he participated in the end of that war. He is going to be biding his time, and he's going to try to put some of this stuff back into action in about 15, 20 years after this. All right, so that's the end of the fighting in the 18th century in this frontier area of the Ohio and of the area that would later be, Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, Alabama, etc., etc., etc. So that's where we are during the administration of President George Washington. I want to emphasize again that the year 1794 was extremely important in American Indian history. Remember I said that, with the essentially with the collapse of that two-front double war against the United States, with the Ohio country in the north, with the Western Confederacy up there, and the Chickamauga group in the South, then that was a big turning point. Most of the tribes in the South learned from that defeat that they could not militarily stand up to the United States. Now, the tribes in the North, in the Ohio country, didn't learn that, and they would try again. But nonetheless, they were facing the same issues that the tribes in the South were. And again, remember, when I'm talking about North and South, really I'm talking about the northern and southern sections of what was at that time the Western frontier. Well, what do I mean when I say they were facing the same situation? Well, for a couple of centuries at this point, the various Indian tribes had basically a situation in which they may have been at a serious disadvantage against the European colonial powers, but they could still have some leverage. And the reason they could have some leverage is because these various European powers were always at war with one another. So a tribe could say to the English, you need to make a good deal with us and treat us well, or we will side with the French, or we will side with the Spanish. And they could say the same thing to the French or the Spanish, If you don't treat us right, we'll go over to the English. And that gave them some power. It gave them some pull. All that had faded away significantly by 1763 because, the Spanish were in Florida, but they hadn't really made any headway in what is now Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And the French were basically chased off by the English. But still, the English government that the various tribes were facing was located across the ocean in London and had bigger problems than what was going on with the Indians, took a broader view. Now, after the American Revolution, everything changed because the British were essentially defeated. I mean, they were up in Canada, but no longer in what is now the United States. And what that meant was that the various Indian tribes only had one white power, essentially, to contend with, and that was the United States of America. There was no one to play them off against. And there was another problem. Now remember, I said that the British government across the ocean, they took the big view, the global view. They had to worry about holding on to India. They had to worry about other colonies all around the world, from South America to the islands in the Pacific. So therefore, they were simply not as concerned about what the colonists in those 13 colonies wanted, which was to move west, right? So that proclamation line was set up. But after the American Revolution, the British are out of the picture, and now it's the U.S. government that all those tribes have to deal with. It's not just a matter of there only being one power, one Anglo-European white power to deal with. It's something else that's at issue here. If the British Parliament made decisions based on what was best for their empire globally, the new government of the United States had different concerns, because the representatives of that government, the people who were going to be in the state legislatures, the people who were going to be in Congress, are people who are elected to go there from within those 13 states. So they have to keep the people in those states happy, the white people who want to move westward. If they don't, they'll be voted out of office, something that the colonists couldn't do to members of Parliament back in England. So not only is there a single monolithic government for the tribes to deal with, it is a representative government whose every individual member has in his vested interest getting those Indians land by whatever means possible. So that leads us to the situation after 1794, or actually up to after 1789, when the Constitution is ratified and the new government is sworn in. By the way, this is a statue here, really cool statue in Pittsburgh, of George Washington talking with an Iroquois leader. So what is going to be this new government's policy? Well, that Constitution that I just mentioned essentially prevented states from dealing with Indians. Some states would try anyway. We'll be talking about that later when we get to the Trail of Tears. But essentially, according to what is known as the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, only the U.S. Congress can make treaties with Indian nations. So individual states can't do that. So the power rests with the federal government. The question is going to be, what is going to become of all these Indians living within the borders of what is now the United States of America? What's going to happen to them? Should they stay or should they go? Many people argue that they should go because they are, quote, savages that can never be, quote, civilized. They're incapable of being civilized. However, some governmental leaders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson did not believe that Native Americans were naturally inferior to white people. And if that sounds kind of progressive, both of them did believe that black people are. But they believed that it would be entirely possible for American Indians to be absorbed into white America, essentially, in time. And both were in favor of not eradicating the Indians, but rather of, quote, again, quote, civilizing the Indians. I keep saying quote because, well, Native Americans had a civilization. It was just different from the European-style civilization that people, United States citizens had at that time. Anyway, there was some diverging opinions about what should happen to the Indians. Some people believe they should be removed out of the United States and sent west of the Mississippi River, which was the border of the United States, essentially, at that time. Others, that was one option, just remove them. Another was that they just totally disappear. Now, they're not going to do that on their own, so they have to be helped along in that process by all being killed. So that was the second one, exterminate them. The third option was to encourage them to take up European-style ways of living and eventually to have them absorbed into the greater white civilization of America. And that had happened to many of the Indians living in New England, because by this point we are almost 200 years out from first contact between the English and the Indians of New England. Many of them, many tribes, had completely disappeared by, disease, warfare, but also survivors kind of marrying in and being absorbed into the greater civilization. So that's three different approaches. Notice, three different approaches. None of them say anything about leaving the Indians alone to live as they want to live on their own land. That was not considered to be an option by virtually anybody in the government at that time. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about George Washington being the first president. He's going to kind of set the tone for U.S. government and Indians. Now, remember that statue of Washington talking to an Iroquois leader, specifically a Seneca leader. Also remember that the Iroquois had always been allies of the English, except at the very beginning when they were allies of the Dutch. But throughout the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, most Iroquois were staunch allies of the English, which meant they were the enemies of the United States during the Revolution. And the Iroquois were not fond of George Washington at all. They called him the town destroyer because he had actually led an expedition as a general in the Revolution into the Iroquois towns there in New York and just destroyed the towns to punish them for siding with the English and also for some of the specific military actions they had taken. So Iroquois didn't trust him too much. In general, though, Washington, as I said, had at least some positive views of Native Americans and believed that they were as capable of being educated as anybody, and that there was hope for them to become American, essentially. Of course, he held in reserve, and he actually said this, that if they refused, then they could be, and this was his word, extirpated, which is another way of saying exterminated. So his policy toward the Indians, and this was, again, what's going to set the tone, was what's sometimes called a 6-point civilizing system. Number one, he called for impartial justice to Indians. Treat them fairly. Number two, regulated buying of Native American lands, and by regulated, that means controlled by the government, not left willy-nilly to individuals. Number three, the promotion of commerce, that is, trade with the Indians. Number four, the promotion of experiments to civilize or improve Indian society. And that's going to particularly include providing them with European-style farming implements and teaching them to farm, quote-unquote, the right way, the European way, the white American way, as opposed to the way they did it, which was, in many cases, actually better. Number five, the president has the authority to give gifts to American Indian leaders. And number six, Washington called for punishment for anyone who violated the rights of Native Americans. Now that sounds good, as impartial justice toward Indians sounds good. The problem was actually enforcing that, which turned out to be really hard to do because so many white citizens of the U.S. Were not keen on these ideas at all. So anyway, this civilizing program got underway And particularly in the tribes in the South, a lot of these new ways were being introduced to them. And at the same time, those tribes in the South, remember, they figured out now they can't fight against the U.S. on the battlefield and win. So they figure out they got to do something different. So they actually accepted many of these changes, many of these new ways of doing things, not as a repudiation of their own way, but as kind of a little bit of a leg up, kind of a little bit of a head start to be able to keep their independence and compete with the United States. Well, we'll skip over John Adams. He didn't do a whole lot where Indians were concerned, and go to the third president, Thomas Jefferson. Remember, I had said that he, like Washington, believed that American Indians were not genetically inferior, although, like Washington, he did believe black people were. In fact, he admired the Indians. He admired them since he was a young boy on his father's plantation in Virginia, when Native American visitors who were friends of his father would come through and tell him stories and stuff. He kind of romanticized them. He viewed them as doomed, the vanishing American, that they were noble, but there was no way they could stand up against the superiority of American civilization, and they were doomed to be swept away. Now, his interest in Indians extended beyond just theoretical. On his plantation of Monticello in Virginia, there were Indian mounds that he actually excavated very carefully, going down layer by layer, making him essentially one of the first American anthropologists. He had a very scientific mind, you know. Some people might also consider that profaning the burial ground of the Indians, but, you know, most white people didn't care about that. He also studied Native American languages. He encouraged intermarriage between Indians and white people so that with each successive generation they could become more white, basically breed the Indian out of them. And again, this is not something that he encouraged outwardly with black people, although we know that privately he engaged in it. So another significant thing about Jefferson is that he was the first person, the first government official to come out publicly and outline a plan to remove them from the United States. Now, that may sound kind of odd because I just talked about how much he admired them. And the fact that he wanted to see them treated fairly and he wanted them to prosper. But, unlike Washington, Jefferson believed that that was impossible, not due to any inability on the part of Indians. It was impossible due to the greed of their white neighbors, who would not be patient, long enough for the Indians to reach the same type of civilization as white people, and would be in a hurry to just kill them all so as to get their land. Jefferson believed, well, he believed that America needed that land the Indians were on. We'll talk later. We'll talk later about Jefferson's agrarian ideal and his desire for small independent farmers to be the backbone of America, which required more land. But he believed that the land belonging to Native Americans should never be forcibly taken away from them by force of arms and conquest. He believed that was immoral and wrong. And he came up with another way to get them removed. And again, he wanted to see them removed from his point of view for their own protection. It's a way that the U.S. could get their land without them all winding up being killed. So, as president, he started putting this plan into action, and he outlined that plan in a letter that he wrote when he was president to William Henry Harrison, who was the military governor of Indiana Territory. And by the way, Jefferson's the third president. William Henry Harrison is, much later on, going to be the 9th president of the United States. Anyway, Jefferson laid out his plan. His plan essentially was, here's what let's do. I'm paraphrasing, of course. Here's what let's do. Let us engage in trade with the Indians. We want their land, right? So let's set up official government trading posts. If these trading posts are sponsored by the government, we can afford to undersell any private American citizens who are trying to set up trading posts, and we can have lower prices and drive them out of business. So the Indians have no choice, if they want to trade, than to trade with our official trading posts. And what we will do is introduce them to the idea of credit, which is something that Native American people had no previous concept of. Credit. We're going to introduce them to various things that will seem like initially luxuries that will quickly come to seem like necessities. And the only way they can get them, because they can't make them themselves, is through our trading posts. And they can't afford to get all that they want. We'll give them credit. And then we will call that credit in and demand payment. And when we do that, not having any actual money, the Indians, in order to settle up, will have no choice but to sell their land to us. And that's how we'll get their land without killing them. And it's all for their own good anyway. They need to become farmers, simple farmers, no more hunting. They don't need all that land anyhow. And this is a plan of a way to kind of go around the back door, kind of an end run, to put them in a position where they have no choice and kind of more subtly force them to lose their land. Now, hopefully you've recognized that that plan was put into place and pretty much worked. It is true that Jefferson's plan is a lot nicer than the plan of, hey, let's just go kill them all. But at the same time, it does seem kind of underhanded. Well, meanwhile, over in the actual Indian country, particularly in the South, under the administration first of Washington, then Adams, then Jefferson, you had the civilizing program going on, and it involved government agents going in and dealing with the various tribes. Here's one of the more famous ones, Benjamin Hawkins, who was the official government agent to the Creek Indian tribe and kind of was the overseer for all the government agents in the South. So the idea, teach them how to do European-style agriculture. And by the way, that's going to involve also teaching them to buy and use African slaves, teaching them to treat those African slaves as inferior, because that's American at that time. So you've got this focus on Americanizing the Indians. Introduce them to commodities, coffee, sugar, as well as, metal tools and weapons and so forth. Shift them to capitalism away from subsistence. Get rid of this idea of reciprocity, which means this is a practice that Indians had of basically giving each other gifts, freely giving away things. Get them out of that habit. That's not American. Change how they attain leadership. Make it more based on what they have. Have a shift in gender roles. Establish a firm European-style patriarchy like God intended, in which women need to learn their place and their proper role. And get Indians, this is the biggest thing, to focus on individual property, private property. That's something that was extraordinarily important in early liberalism, and something that, they didn't really have the word communism, but they were opposed to the idea. To be American, you have to want property, and you have to own property. And then finally, the introduction to them of of debt. Now, like I said, the Indians kind of approached this in the South, in which they welcomed a lot of this stuff in and made use of it, including missionaries that were sent into the Indian nations, and some tribes eventually welcomed those missionaries in. Now, early attempts of missionaries to get in among the Cherokees and the Creeks didn't work very well. In the 1780s, they were chased out because the Indians weren't interested in these people's brand of religion, especially when they heard this thing about how, God's going to burn everybody forever in hell and all that stuff. That didn't sound very equitable to them. It sounded kind of rude, actually, so they chased all the early missionaries off. But after 1794, they welcomed the missionaries in. But not so much because they wanted to change religions. The reason they wanted these missionaries was because missionaries want you to study the Bible, but you have to be able to read the Bible. So missionaries set up schools to teach English reading and writing to the Native American children. And that's what the Cherokee leaders and Creek leaders and Choctaw leaders wanted to see happen. They cannot beat the U.S. on the battlefield. They're going to have to learn to beat them on a different field, their own field, the Americans' own field, the field of law and education. So as all these missionaries from various different denominations are coming in and setting up schools, the Indians in the South are happy to have them there, but very few of them convert. Their children, however, are learning to read and write in English. And this is despite the fact that many of these missionaries, very ethnocentric, many of them had very condescending views toward the Indians. However, beginning in the early 1800s, you started to see some rapid changes in Native American culture in the South among the 5 tribes, later called the 5 civilized tribes. For example, Cherokees, here you see some Cherokees. You'll notice that some of them are dressed traditionally, but many of them are dressed like white people. You'll see that they have a traditional Cherokee summer home in the front that's basically a pavilion without walls, but they've also built a cabin, an American-style cabin. So, among these changes, you had the education brought about by the missionary schools. You also had more and more efforts made to intermarry, particularly to have the Native American women marry American men who were merchants, trappers, or traders, and who could then be brought into the Indian community. And they would have children, right? Now, Americans from that European tradition are patrilineal, but the tribes of the South are all matrilineal, pretty much. That means that if a white man marries, say, a Cherokee woman, their offspring is going to be considered Cherokee by the Cherokees. But by the white people, it will be considered the child of the father and inherit his property. So this was intentional. This didn't just happen by accident. You get a whole generation, couple of generations, of children being born among the Cherokees and Choctaws and Creeks and Chickasaws, children being born who grow up speaking both Cherokee or their own language and English, who grow up learning to read and write, who learn the ways of white America from their fathers, but learn the ways of Native America from their mothers, and think of themselves as Indian, not as wanting to be white, inheriting their father's property that they then bring into the community, into the tribe. In fact, again, tribes are communal, and the property was controlled communally by the tribe. So they would send these kids off to learn to read and write from the missionaries. And the kids who were especially smart, especially bright, the tribal leaders would take tribal money that they were getting from trade with the Americans and send those smart kids to college, often up in New England. Send them up there to college to learn, among other things, to be doctors and lawyers, so that by the late 1820s, you had, so let's say just among the Cherokees, you had Cherokees who were very literate, not just in English, but also in their own language. We'll talk about that later. And you had Native American lawyers admitted to the bar by the late 1820s. And you had Native American businessmen who were very successful, who in some cases had huge farms, plantations even. And this was just 30 years removed from dragging canoe and the Chickamauga raids along the Tennessee settlements. They started to have written laws. And once they had written laws, instead of blood vengeance, they also established their own police forces that were called the Light Horse, or the Light Horse Patrol. Cherokees had them, Creeks had them, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Seminoles had them. Their own police forces. So, essentially, these tribes are very purposely adopting some parts of Euro-American society, but in their hearts were remaining Indian and were planning to use these new tools they had gotten, just like the old tools, to protect their tribal sovereignty and to protect their tribal property in a whole new way. And in fact, you got these leaders among the Indians now who are actually well educated. They're following the news. And all around the world in the 1820s, you had revolutions going on with people who had been colonized, like all through South America, for just one example. Also, there was a war between the Greeks and the Turks who had occupied them. People who had been colonized declaring their independence and setting up their own modern governments. Well, that's what these tribes started doing.